Newton. Newton actually studied ancient Kabbalistic texts and many mystic texts for 15 to 20 years prior to writing physics. And in his private journals, he made clear that he got most of his physics from studying these civilizations. And from my conclusion, I started to realize that maybe there was a very advanced civilization on our planet that had left remains and had left clues for future generations to discover of the fundamental structure of the vacuum, the fundamental structure of creation, and how we could use it to improve our society.
You mentioned Saturn. In your analysis, you continue to observe other interesting facts. For example, the recent images taken by the Cassini probe shows an enormous hexagonal feature on the North Pole of Saturn, first taken 27 years ago and still persistent to this day. The same probe shows a gigantic vortex at the South Pole of Saturn, which seems to be absorbing matter in a whirlpool. The South Pole vortex leads to the center of the planet. There's speculation that there are entries at the poles on planet Earth. Have you studied this possibility?
Yeah, my model predicts, first of all, that it would be reasonable to see actual geometries like the hexagon on the North Pole of Saturn, where actually the plasma dynamics is moving at some 300 miles per hour and turning corners, making an hexagon approximately 1.5 times the size of the Earth on the North Pole of Saturn. But my model as well predicts, see, the tetrahedral geometry in my model is the geometry of the vacuum, the geometry of the space. But the dynamics of the space that makes up a reality is actually a double torus. A torus is like a donut, and if you imagine two donuts on top of each other turning in opposite direction because of Coriolis effect, that
right.
would be the model that so one, the collapsing of the vacuum, which is the gravitational side, is the tetrahedral geometry, the cuboctahedron collapsing. And the result of that collapsing of the vacuum produces a radiative effect that we call the electromagnetic field, and that's the double torus structure. And so you would expect vortices at the poles of planets, and it's really great to see them on Saturn demonstrated so obviously. And, those structures are certainly not accounted by the standard model, but are predicted by my model. And they're found as well at the north and south pole of Saturn, of Jupiter, the north and south pole of the Sun. They're in the plasma dynamics we see everywhere, and certainly you can easily see them at the north and south pole of black holes, like the center of galaxies and quasars and so on. All these objects have huge vortices at their north and south pole, producing this double torus structure that we see so well demonstrated in galaxies. So, all this kind of works out to a very comprehensive model, which actually eliminates the strong and weak force of the quantum theory assumptions and replace them with gravity and the electromagnetic field. In my latest papers, I prove that we can solve atoms as mini black holes, and that actually we don't need to have a strong force to keep the protons together, but that it's actually gravity that's acting on mini black holes we call protons, and that there's plenty of gravity to hold the atom together without the need for a strong force. So, all this starts to give a unified model, and I can solve for unification using semi-classical physics like Einstein field equations, all the way from universal size all the way down to subatomic particles of the atom, and I get the right answers, meaning I get the right, decay emissions and so on for the atom, but I don't use two theories that conflict with each other.
So what you're saying is that planet Earth also should have those two vortices on each pole?
Yeah, actually, those two vortices on each pole have been found. They're geomagnetic vortices. They were found about a decade ago, and they were found as a result of us finding that there was ozone holes at the north and south pole of our planet. And at first, it was thought that that was the result of various chemicals polluting the atmosphere and making holes in the ionosphere, in the ozone layer. But actually, they realized that it was actually because there's a north and south pole magnetic vortices, geomagnetic vortices, and the ions of the ozone layer follows the vortices towards the ground, and so it makes holes at the north and south pole.
So what happens, in practical terms, if you take a ship, an icebreaker ship, and you go all the way to those vortices? What would happen to you if you continue to go until you reach those vortices?
Well, these vortices have been kept track of. They're measured all the time. People go and measure them all the time. And, one thing is that they seem to have been accelerating. So that means that there's changes that are occurring, and those changes might be precursor to pole shifts on our planet. I think what you're leading to is the inner Earth theories that
yes.
There may be holes at the north and south pole. My theory would predict that yes, there could be holes at the poles. In the case of Saturn, they're becoming apparent. But these holes would probably fill up and open up periodically because the center of the vortex would be very cold. So any moisture there would ice up and plug the hole with ice. And I think that's why we find ice at the poles of all the planets, or we find that the poles of all the planets are much cooler than the equator, including for the sun. And so I don't know, and my theory as well would predict that the center of the Earth would have a certain amount of space in it, that there would be a part that would be hollow. And that actually, and this might be a little shocking, but that actually our planet is the host of a small black hole at the center that provides the energy potential that our planet has, the rotation that our planet has, which is not explained in standard theory. If you ask a physicist why is the Earth spinning, can't really tell you where it got its angular moment or where it got its magnetic moment. So if you take actually the magnetic field at the surface of the Earth, which is about 7 Gauss, which is quite large considering, that it must have emitted from the center of the Earth, from the core of the Earth, and, magnetic field drops at the square of the distance. So, it would have to be, if you calculate backwards towards the center and try to figure out how strong it would have to be in the center, you need a black hole in the middle of the planet to produce such a large magnetic field. Now, I know that many scientists out there would find that preposterous, but we're finding more and more. You got to realize that 15 years ago, my theory predicted we were going to find black holes at the center of all galaxies. And I was, in some cases, laughed out at physics conference for that. However, black holes were found at the center of all galaxies. My theory as well predicted that black holes were there prior to the galaxies, not that the mass of the galaxy produced a black hole, but that the black hole is the source of material existence, and so that it produced a galaxy. And now, just recently, with new probes, we've been able to peer past about 1 billion years after the Big Bang, which is very early after the Big Bang, and we're finding that black holes seem to have been there before galaxies. So, my theory predicts there's a black hole at the center of the sun, there's a black hole at the center of the Earth, and so on. And that black holes are not just